Hey everyone, this is Moses Siragar. It's March 19th, 2020, and I'm doing an introduction to holistic locational astrology. That's what I call my work. And I always like to start with the real-time clock. So yeah, we're going to talk for maybe 90 minutes or so. At the end of that, I'm going to do a drawing for everyone who's there. And we'll see. Someone will get free tuition to the class I have coming up. So this is the master class on locational astrology here. You can find out more on my website. It's astrologyforthesoul.com. You can click on the classes link. If you're an alumni to the class, like you've been through a previous class with me, then there's an alumni rate as well. And May 5th is the day coming up. And we're just kind of talking about this subject today so you guys can see a little bit of where I'm coming from with all this. So let me check here real quick. We're going to check the chat again. So the chat is going to be the best place for you guys to comment. Feel free to do that. If you have questions, I may or may not be able to answer them today. Feel free to comment in there. And hello, everyone. Hi, Kathy. All right, good stuff. Well, we have astrocartography, right? So Jim Lewis back in the 70s, was popularizing this. So, I mean, we're looking at something in the 50-year range since this has come around, and that's, significant length of time. So we do astrocartography a certain way. I usually call it locational astrology. Astrocartography was a trademark term, from Jim Lewis. So locational astrology, I like. It's nice and kind of neutral and just works for me. So, but, for a lot of the, the things like search engines, people are still searching for astrocartography. So that's a relevant word to all this as well. So we started with this astrocartography, and Jim Lewis was super brilliant, really. I mean, he took something astrologically that works for people very well. He mapped it. Here's a client I had recently. He figured out how to map it in a way that was for individuals. Before him, we used to make maps more so for global events, mundane astrology, trying to predict what's going to happen when there's an eclipse or things like that. So, so when Jim Lewis made a map, he would, let's turn off the local space lines here. He would see something kind of like this. He would have a certain calculation that he was using, and you would find out things like, where was the moon at the midheaven when this client of mine recently was born? Well, that was near, Iceland. And where was the moon rising? That was near Las Vegas or San Diego. And this is astrocartography, right? So we have astrocartography. It's basically where the planets are essentially on the angles, where they were, as Jim Lewis did it, more specifically astronomically, where they were actually rising and setting, culminating or anti-culminating. And the idea is that these are these great big, compass points, directional cardinal points on for our lives, and connected to the angles of astrology, and that when the planets are on these positions, they become very influential. So this idea is quite valid. It's of course it's quite valid. The problem is it's so useful by itself that we think that it explains more than it does usually. And this is part of why I call my work holistic astrology in general. I'm always looking with my approach to learn something new, and to be curious, and to be humble, and to find out, how to see things from different perspectives that can all be mutually, supportive of what you're going for. A broader, rounder picture of anything, really. And we get into one of the great big issues, I suppose, when we get into this sort of thing. We have, a tropical zodiac like we use in the West. And that zodiac is based on the seasons, essentially, so that when you get to the spring, you have the sun at 0 Aries. And we also have a sidereal zodiac, which does not use the seasons really in any way. And this is the great divide, essentially, between the Vedic astrologers and the Western astrologers. Let's look right now, actually. This is a bit timely. Let's see. So this is basically right before we started this class here. So this is a sidereal position for the planets right now. And so some of you will not be used to this. You're looking at this and seeing, Neptune and Aquarius. Probably seems weird. That was a while ago. But notice, what's going on here. We won't touch on this too much today, but Jupiter and Mars are about to go into Capricorn in sidereal astrology. That's going to be pretty interesting. Pluto's there too. So I have a hard time looking at half the world essentially saying, oh, we do astrology this way, and the other half saying, oh, we do astrology this way, and buying into any of these, I think, patently ridiculous arguments that one side is right and the other side is wrong. I mean, that's vaguely theoretically possible, but you don't, to have an untold number of astrologers who practice a sidereal and a tropical approach, you have to recognize at some point that they are touching different parts of the elephant. Now, locational astrology, and go back to Astro Cartography, what Jim Lewis was doing. Let's say this client here is thinking about moving to San Francisco. Well, the sun is on the IC there, right? So when this person was born, the sun was anti-culminating near San Francisco. That means, not like the sun at the zenith, near the middle of the day, high noon. That would be the sun at the midheaven, basically. This is the opposite of that. This is when the sun is at the kind of the midnight point, when the people on the other side of the world are looking up and seeing the sun. And essentially we have, what I like about this, where it becomes reasonable once you get more and more comfortable with at least just using some of the basics of the zodiac you're maybe not as familiar using. And this is just one aspect of holistic locational astrology. It's just the zodiac issue, but it is one of these things. And so anyway, here we have someone here's a tropical chart for this client, and the sun is right at the middle of Gemini. So of course it's going to be in, what sign in sidereal astrology. Typically you subtract about 24 degrees, and we're going to get into Taurus. So there's different issues that come up with this, but essentially, a Vedic astrologer could see this and say, oh, there's the sun in Taurus on the IC. And a Western astrologer could say, oh, there's the sun in Gemini on the IC. And they could each tell their own story about that. And they're touching different parts of the elephant. That's certainly, what I would endeavor to show you guys over the course of the class I have coming up, and pretty much in everything that I do, I'd like to look at that. So this is what's nice about the astrocartography lines. They're astronomical facts of the moment that you're born. So if this client really likes, her moon, for example, she could choose to live on this moon rising line, right, and go to, I don't know, Boise, Idaho, or somewhere along that line. And then we have to understand the impact of that line. So part of what I attempt to do here, and there are going to be, and this is a very important part of what I do, there's basically 6 major types of influences that you can see from natal influences that are going to give you permanent information about what happens when someone lives in a place or visits a place or interacts with a person really from that place, and that could be, your boyfriend or girlfriend who's from, Timbuktu. I mean, that chart actually matters. And if you met the person in a certain place, that matters. So if you meet each other in Chicago, your chart in Chicago is now very important for that relationship. There's lots of ways that this information just sort of keeps going in really fascinating ways. But we have to be able to look at, I would argue, these 6 things. And I will say, and I don't know how to say this in a way that probably sounds right, but Jim Lewis was looking at 2 things when he was looking at natal influences, the permanent influences. Like if you go to, Jim Lewis obviously has passed away, rest in peace. If you go to him back in the day and you follow someone who does things the way he did them, and you say, hey, what happens when I live in Denver? Well, actually, in this case, there wouldn't be any lines terribly close. So he, in that case, wouldn't have as much to say, really. Now, he did use parens. That's number 2, or at least it's, another of the 6 things that I look at. So you have parens, which are these lines that are very specific to latitude. And you have a combination of 2 planetary energies. We look at this, in great depth in my class, because I would say I'm probably I'm pretty, I don't know. I think I have one method that's sort of my own thing, and then probably the parens are the other thing where I'm probably, I don't know, best at that thing. Just because I'm very curious about them, I look at them a lot, and they're very specific to latitude. So this is the technique that's really, really neat and useful when you're trying to figure out where you want to go within a certain area. For example, so I'll just put my my map up real quick. So down here, now I live in basically Prescott, Arizona. It's right up here. I've actually just moved just to Prescott Valley and right on the border of the 2, but we'll just call it Prescott. You can see down here near Phoenix and Scottsdale, I have a latitude of the moon and Pluto. If you have something at Phoenix, you have it also at Los Angeles. Congratulations. And also you have it over in Atlanta, where I lived for 15 years, basically growing up. So what's fascinating about this is that this gives you a very specific experience at that very specific latitude. Jim Lewis actually used up to 2 degrees on that orb, 2 degrees of latitude. And I don't think that it's a terribly good latitude. And I would argue that he probably used a wider orb than we should typically use, because he was actually working with fewer tools than we have available to us today. He used parens, he used astrocartography lines. So he tended to use big orbs, and I would argue it's probably because he didn't have a lot of other things to look at. I do, and I have a lot of other things that help me fine tune. So if you took away, I don't know, one or two of my 6 things that I do, I would be unhappy about that, because I like to see the whole picture as much as I can. These parens, again, are very specific to latitude. So where I live here in Prescott is about an hour north if you drive. It's like an hour north, an hour west. But you can see it's exactly 1 degree of latitude basically from this moon and Pluto. You can see that up in the top left corner. It's pretty tiny. It's 1 degree of latitude, which is about 68, 69 miles. So I don't feel this one in Prescott like the way I do in Phoenix or Scottsdale. So I've lived in Atlanta. I've been to Phoenix. Obviously, I live not too far from there. Been to LA. And it's funny, I'll give you a funny example of the kind of thing that will happen to me on those lines. There's a good chance if I go into those cities, I'm going to end up in a bar at some point. I don't actually drink much alcohol at all, but I would go to hear music, and it'll be dark, and there'll be some kind of, loud, intense music going on. And there's this rawness to it. And I find myself in those situations, and that's one kind of silly but real example, where you have that happening constantly at that latitude. It's an example of one of the things you might experience, right? Moon and Pluto can be good for certain things. Anything can be good for certain things. But so this is one of the 2 things Jim Lewis would look at. So he would have seen this. He would have said, oh, well, there's a moon and Pluto here. Now, he would have said it extends up to 2 degrees up here. So that's, we can kind of talk about that. But you can see why, for example, I do try to avoid this line as much as I can. And it used to be that I would fly into this city, Phoenix, with my ex-wife, and we would notice we would have, I don't know, kind of a silly argument or something. And then we drive north up to Prescott, and it wouldn't be there. Okay, another example of that. Here's Tucson, where I have Saturn and Pluto together. Not really a great combination. Everyone is talking about Saturn and Pluto because of the transit, but generally people don't do too well on a Saturn-Pluto paren either. It's the slow, stodgy kind of energy. So I was down in Tucson after I went through massage school some years back, and was helping with a shiatsu class, and I got this illness when I was down there that I couldn't shake. Normally when I get sick, I kind of fast, and I just kind of get through it pretty well. And this thing just wouldn't go away. It was weird. And I realized after a little while, oh yeah, I'm on this line. I probably just have to get off of it, And so sure enough, I drove back home, drove up to Prescott here. And, within a couple of days or whatever, I was feeling pretty good again. So you learn about these certain lines. And for example, this is why I've never actually spoken in Seattle, been invited to Seattle, but I have Saturn and Pluto right there in Seattle. So you start to see these things, and you start to know, well, hey, it doesn't really work for me in this place. It doesn't really work for me in this place. It's probably not the best place to go. I mean, for example, I've spoken to a number of organizations as an astrologer. But around San Diego, around Tucson, I have this Saturn Pluto, and I've noticed I generally don't, let's say, make as much money if I go speak to those groups for whatever reason. It's probably me, But I noticed that, right? So then you get to make smarter decisions, I suspect, about things like, hey, should I go accept that invitation to go speak in Seattle? It's probably not, I could do it. I could give a good talk or whatever, hopefully. But overall, it's probably not going to be as much as what I'm looking for as some other place, let's say. So anyway, those are parens. So we have 2 things we've talked about so far: the astrocartography lines. Here I have Saturn, at the midheaven right here, for example, and then you have parens, and they are specific to latitude. And we talk about how to kind of measure that and how to consider how strong is it. And yeah, this upcoming class, what I endeavor to do certainly is have a number of handouts that are going to become a part of hopefully a book that I'm working on here on the subject. And so I hope to have a number of these handouts for this book. And so one of them will be about the parens, because really, these parens are really interesting. And I have just experienced just asking tons of people. So let me tell you a little more about how I work. So typically when someone works with me, what I suggest they send me, and they don't have to, but I suggest they send me a history of where they've lived. And that history includes, the years they were there and just some basic notes on the experiences, especially anything really significant in those places. So whenever I work with a client, I go in and I basically study the person's biography, and I go through and I make sure that everything makes sense. If what I would have thought about the places from the past isn't accurate, then I'm not going to be really, itching to make a prediction for the future if we're not calibrated yet to the past either. So part of how I do this is I go in and really study this. So every place a person's lived, if they give me the notes, I go and I look at every single place, and I see all the parents, and I see all the everything. There's, again, 6 main things that I look at. So it's really important to have a broad view of these different things. And this is part of the fun of it. It can get a little bit frustrating too when you start to realize that there are a lot of things that tell you things about a place. And it's not as simple as astrocartography. It's way more, it's more holistic, really. There's just more going on. So for example, what's a good example here of, well, okay, we'll go to my client here recently. So this person, we're going to turn the planet directions back on. Those are the local space lines. So this is the third thing that, I would look at. And actually we're going to throw Trump up here for a minute too, with his local space. I just looked at it a minute ago and I thought it was pretty interesting given what's going on right now. So what we have here, it looks like a bunch of lines coming out of, Denver, which is where this person was born. And each of these lines, like let's take the red one here, that's the sun. This line is really a circle. It's a circle that goes around the Earth. So each planet has its own orientation from that place of birth. So let's say we draw a big compass on the ground or something like that, and you have a baby right there in Denver. We're going to, take a snapshot of that moment, and we're going to see, hey, which direction is the sun? Well, let's say it's due north. It's not in this case. Due north, well, hey, it's going to go around the Earth in a big circle, just like a meridian basically at that point. But there's usually a curve, as you can see. And these lines go all the way around the Earth. These are fascinating to watch because you'll see people who will travel, they'll go the most random places and they'll follow these lines. And it seems like they have some reason, some purpose. Why did they, continue to follow that particular line? This is part of our sleuthing, part of our detective work here. So this client had a really bad time in South Korea, did not really agree with her. And what we see when we look at those local space lines, Saturn and Mars go right here near Seoul, South Korea, where this individual was. Notice here, someone made the point about the Pluto line. So I'm going to check in the chat real quick, and I'll show you that very quickly about the Pluto bit. Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. Thank you. Feel free to add, comments and questions in the chat. I will occasionally go in there and look for those. I may or may not answer if you have a question, if it's, on topic or not. So, because we do have just a little time today. All right, cool. So, yeah, so this is local space. So this is a giant, a giant circle going around the Earth, right? It goes through Denver. You can see for this individual comes down this way. It's going to follow the, this eastern bit of China here as well. And, it's fun. I mean, you can follow these things around and see where they are and see how things line up. When you start looking at 6 different techniques, you can start to try to get a more perfect location, hopefully, and one of the issues with when you look at a number of things is it's easy to find something you don't like in a place. And guess what? It's easy to find something you don't like in your life at any given moment, and in any given place. So we don't necessarily find perfection in that sense, but we look at what is there and what does seem to be the challenge, and if it seems to be manageable or not. There are situations where I am pretty darn positive based on everything I'm seeing and all the confluence of everything I'm seeing that, let's say, a certain place is just terrible for relationships. A lot of people have that experience of living in a place that is not going to give you the relationship you're at least looking for. Now, what is the lesson in that? That's above my pay grade. But what I can do is look and tell you, hey, what happens if you go live in Seoul? Now this client, notice here, Pluto rising is right here. Also awfully close, right? Now that's the Inmundo position for Pluto. That's the one Jim Lewis would have put on his maps. This is a zodiacal position, which will often move more than this. It could be quite there could be quite a distance between these things. But you'll notice that Sol is on either side of the Pluto lines here. So in this case, we have Pluto and Pluto. We have Saturn and Mars. And, and even the parents that are there are not terribly inspiring. This one is Mars in Ceres. And I have seen this one usually either, pretty rough or good for Mars-related things. It can be good for those things. We also have then another thing, a relocated chart. Now we'll call this number 4. This is I'll go ahead and pull this one up here. All right, so here's a relocated chart. This is currently cast in the Porphyry house system. Notice that Porphyry will trisect the quadrants equally. So the 7th, 8th, and 9th houses, for example, here are exactly the same length. I do like the systems that are mathematically simple, and so I use the most mathematically simple house systems I can, because not just because it's a theory. Actually, it's kind of a long story, but basically they're the ones that work for me, and I do like that they're simple. I think there's something nice in simplicity. A lot of my system is based on things that are kind of simple, but then of course the interpretation can get very nuanced. And yet the basics of it, and the reason I think it is teachable is the basics are simple. It's the subtleties of the different placements that gets more complicated. Anyway, this is a relocated chart. A big part of what we will do in the class is I will show you guys how to read this. How to read it in the way that I read it. And the way that I read it is not the way I started, not the way I initially thought you would read it. I learned things about how the relocated chart works simply and only by talking to so many people and looking at tens of thousands of places where people have lived. Not kidding. Like looking at that, studying them, studying the relocated chart, studying the map, studying everything. And yeah, after having that experience, there are things that presented themselves to me, which I really like, because I didn't come to it with my own preconceived notions. I wasn't just projecting what I thought. In fact, I was looking at charts and people were telling me what happened, and I said, okay, well, this is something I'm noticing. And then I just noticed it more and more, and it worked, kind of better and better. So over the years, I have been refining this. And I think what I do with the relocated chart, I think it's as useful as anything in locational astrology. And I hope that someday when I'm not around anymore, people are still using this, because this is potentially life-saving stuff, actually. Let me just talk about that for a moment, just kind of the seriousness of all this. There are some kinds of astrology where you're not really playing with a lot of fire. You can give someone a reading and maybe, hopefully you don't steer them astray, but you're not too worried about causing them a significant amount of harm if you come at it with that approach, right? Locational astrology is a real thing. If you go to a place and you have a number of influences there, okay, this client here, you can see in the chart the Pluto rising. We basically saw that on the map as well. We could kind of riff on this chart, but I'm trying not to go into that today because that is a big part of what I teach in the class. But again, we have Saturn and Mars, the two traditional malefics. We have Pluto flanking this place with both of his ascending lines. Generally, I don't find people generally don't like Pluto rising places all that much. And sometimes it feels like you've got this kind of black cloud around you there, because the ascendant is where people meet you and they see you and they either like you, they don't like you, whatever. If they meet you and they meet Pluto, well, imagine what that could be like. They could project, ooh, what's that dark cloud around that person? Or maybe the person isn't more intense, maybe they are unconsciously looking to trigger their trauma a little more. Pluto can be about that. So anyway, Pluto is not my favorite line to recommend as a rising line. And just over time, you just see these things enough that you just kind of see the trends with them and what typically happens. So in this case, a double Pluto rising, that alone says, socially, you're probably not going to connect as well. Double Saturn Mars, this person is born with an opposition of, if I can get the right chart here, of Saturn and Mars. So there's Mars at 6 Leo, that's tropical, Saturn 6 Aquarius. Mars is in Cancer if you do Vedic or sidereal, so it's in its fall. And this is one of the main things that you have to, one of the main reasons I would argue that you have to use sidereal and tropical. And if you don't want to, just do a little, would be my suggestion. So for example, just look at whether the planet is in a position of dignity in the other approach. I will tell you, don't pay that much attention to detriment. Detriment can be a problem. So let me explain these concepts real quick. You have rulership. Let's look at this chart, see if we have any examples of this here. Saturn here is in his rulership, Aquarius. Okay, so Saturn's in rulership. Retrograde's another story. We may or may not get to that today. But we have rulership. Okay, generally a planet's strong in his rulership. It's his own place. He's the king in his castle, the queen in her castle. That planet can control their own affairs better, get things done in their own way. It's a good, solid, very strong position. Nothing wrong with that. That's one of the things we like to see, generally. Okay, so we have, let's see here. Do we have any detriment examples here? A detriment would be the opposite of that. So let's say Saturn was in Cancer, or Leo in this case. But Saturn in Cancer would be detriment. Saturn in Leo would be detriment. Detriment is a problem for the planet. It's just not that big of a deal compared to the fall. The fall is a much bigger deal. And I will offer Vedic astrology as some evidence of this, or at least an argument for it, where the concept of detriment doesn't exist. Simple as that. Planet in its fall, absolutely. It's one of the most critical things. If a planet is in its fall, they literally just say it's debilitated. There's not a lot of subtlety sometimes. But if that planet is debilitated, if it's in its fall, that becomes a super big deal. So we have every traditional planet has a sign in its where it's exalted and in its fall, and they are opposite. So in this case, let's look at this as a sidereal chart. We have this one here. So we're going to just change this here to a whole sign sidereal chart. And so here we see Mars in Cancer. Well, Mars in Cancer is the fall for Mars. It's his most difficult sign. It's the opposite of, of Capricorn, where he would be in his exaltation. So exalted planets tend to be more positive, but they also have a lot of force and impact. And you really have to look at things like how are they aspected, how's the dispositor. Generally, exaltation is a good start, but there are many cases where it might not be. For example, let's say Venus in Pisces is rising. Now, that highlights Venus in Pisces. That gives a lot of Venus things to the experience that are potentially quite nice. But from Pisces, which, here we go, we have a Pisces chart I can show you very easily. From Pisces, Venus rules the 8th house, Libra. And Venus rules the 3rd house, Taurus. What's the 3rd house? It's the 8th house from the 8th house. So if we count from 8, we start 8, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. We get to 3. So the 3rd house has a secondary meaning. And I learned this from Vedic astrology. It's one of the most important things I've learned. And it has to be applied when you do this kind of work. The 8th house has a secondary place, and that's in the 3rd. The 3rd is the 8th from the 8th. Its secondary meanings are all the same as the 8th house. So if you then take Venus, let's pretend Venus is in Pisces here, exalted, you're emphasizing the 8th and the 8th from the 8th with great force. That's what exaltation's doing. That may not be good, because the 8th house can be really serious stuff, really serious life and death stuff. You can see in this client here in Sol, the sun was quite close to the 8th cusp. That would also be true if we use equal house. So that's the other house system I use. It's very mathematically simple, just like porphyry. In that case, the rising degree is the house cusp in every house. You see things like Robert Hand writing in his book on whole sign houses and arguing that the rising degree should be considered like what, in fact, there's a Vedic school of thought called, it's kind of a neo-Vedic approach called systems approach. And they actually have a term for this. They call it the MEP, or most effective point. They believe that the most effective point in every house is the rising degree. So arguably this client here in South Korea, we would use 13.5 degrees in every house cusp. Well, what happens when we do that? The sun is still with the 8th house cusp, just like it is in porphyry. So that's an example of an 8th house activation or story that's going to be really significant. This client actually had a quincunx between Sun and Pluto and had some weird issues with a boyfriend, weird issues with a boss, a lot of uncomfortable stuff like that. And it was an awful place. Like, just kind of the list went on and on. Just wasn't a really terribly good place for this individual. So, yeah, let me see, where were we? Apologize, I think I lost my train of thought on something, but we'll get it back. What are we talking about? We're talking about sidereal placements and the fall, right? So a planet in its fall is going to give you a lot of information, and it's very often something to avoid. So back to this client here, interesting situation here because the client has Mars in Cancer, which is the fall. This is sidereal or Vedic astrology, and Jupiter in Cancer, which is the exaltation. This is a kind of remedial measure for Mars, or a cancellation of debility, as they would say more on the Vedic side of it, because Mars is with the exalted ruler of the sign he's in. That's Jupiter, and conjoined by Jupiter, who is benefic. So this Mars is better off than a Mars that didn't have that. If Jupiter wasn't in Cancer, wasn't conjunct Mars, Mars wouldn't benefit, from that like it is here. So there's a lot of nuance to this, right? There's a lot of knobs, I meant to pull up, and this is slightly inappropriate, but I meant to pull up. You guys ever see the meme that goes around occasionally about the difference between male and female sexuality? I have Scorpio rising, so I can talk about that. The male is like a knob, or actually it's a light switch, isn't it? It's like an on and off. The female sexuality is a million knobs, right? And that's more like what I do, actually. Astrocartography, I would say, as it's more traditionally practiced, is a little more like the male side of that meme. It's pretty simple. It's like, okay, is there this line? Is there a parent? Oh, there's nothing close. There's just not a lot of information in it. And it's pretty simplistic, actually. Now, you can do the best you can with it, but there's only so much material to work with there, honestly. So I like having a fuller set of tools so that I can get a better perspective on everything and see the depth of it as well as I can. And so I don't want to miss out on anything that could tell me whether or not a place is, going to be a serious issue for someone or not. So to finish the point, if you don't use sidereal or you don't use tropical, what I would highly suggest that you do, especially if you're looking at locational astrology, let's say, Jupiter and Mars lines for this individual. We consider these things differently because of exaltation or fall, or here Saturn and rulership. So if you do nothing else, consider the planets in their rulership, in the other system, the other approach, or their fall or their exaltation. And if you see those things, do not ignore it. I don't recall if it was actually, it might be one of the people here, I don't want to mention him by name, but one of the people here in this class right now, I think it may be this individual. But I remember just an example being in like a Facebook group and someone posting, hey, I'm living in this place and I have my Jupiter in Aquarius at the midheaven, and it's not that good. My teaching job has not been that good here. You feel free to speak up if that's you. I'm not sure if that was you or not. You know who you are if it's you. Anyway, what do you know about Jupiter and Aquarius in Western astrology? It's probably going to be in Capricorn if you look at sidereal astrology. That was the case here. So this was not a good place for the individual, and partly because Jupiter at the midheaven isn't often as good as you want it to be either, but especially not in Capricorn if if it has any other issues. Now, you wouldn't see that if you just did tropical astrology. You just see Jupiter in Aquarius, and you might think, hey, this is going to be a good place to be a teacher and, be a part of a community, and perfect, right? And it wasn't. It was totally not. And it's because you have to be really careful with a planet in its fall. That's where the planet goes into its depression. That's where it literally goes into like a ditch on the side of the road, Now, there are benefits to fall. We talk about that too. But you have to recognize the problem. You have to recognize that the planet is challenged by that, right? Like right now, guess what? Jupiter's challenged by being in Capricorn. Mercury's challenged by being in Pisces. And so what's happening globally, right? We have the economic issues, which you can see pretty well generally with what Jupiter's doing. And those economic issues were exacerbated by the fact Jupiter went into Capricorn in tropical around December 1st. And that's literally the first case of coronavirus. So Jupiter in Capricorn, which is his fall, in tropical. This time it's all connected with coronavirus and all the repercussions of that, which are many. So this is not easy for Jupiter right now, right? This is not a Jupiter moment. And it's not necessarily a great Mercury moment either in Pisces right now, because guess what? You can't go see your friends, right? You can't go out if you're doing your social distancing. And, there's just a lot of intensity because everyone's dealing with, these different issues coming up with the virus and the shortages and the economy and everything. So Mercury in Pisces doesn't necessarily give us the best, mental, help with that right now, because we're all in a mood of not being in the best mental place because of this. Like we have more mental challenges because of that. That's Mercury in Pisces. So, for example, you look for the ways then to take advantage of the sign. And so how do we open our compassion and help each other out? Anyway, so just a quick note there. I think you guys kind of heard my point about at least use the other system, at least to see the most powerful placements. A planet in its rulership becomes a lot better. Like, let's say you look at tropical, right? And you've got, I don't know, Saturn in Pisces. But you look at the sidereal and Saturn goes to Aquarius. Well, that Saturn line is probably a lot better than you think it is because of the sidereal placement. So that's one of the things that we look at. And I do teach people how to do that. I don't think it's actually all that hard. And in fact, the longer I practice astrology, the more I'm doing, not completely, but the more I'm doing the same things, regardless of zodiac. For example, there are differences in the houses. Let's look at Donald Trump here. He's our friend. I'm trying not to be political. So we've got, I'll show you this for his relocated, actually for his map. And so look at his Neptune here and Chiron and Jupiter. They're all in tropical Libra, sidereal Virgo. Stationary, you can see, stationary retrograde Jupiter here. And yeah, so the reason I bring these up, let's switch to his map here. That's interesting. I haven't really played with his map a whole lot, but just noticing. Okay, this is kind of interesting. You know what? Let's look at where Wuhan is, because we'll go ahead and do a quick little study on something here. And I'm always learning and I'm always playing around. So I think that's, if you don't have that curiosity, if you start thinking you just know it all, man, you're screwed. You got to stay humble. You got to learn all the time. Anyway, here's Trump in Wuhan, China. Okay. Interesting. Yeah. Here's what I was going to show you initially. So Trump, born in New York here. I think we even have the hospital correct. He has all of these local space lines, obviously centered on that hospital where he's born. So I was looking at what goes to D.C. Obviously, he's in D.C., in the White House. And what goes right to DC? In fact, the only local space line that intersects DC for him is Chiron, and just below it is Jupiter, and just above it is Neptune. This is an awfully kind of medical kind of placement. Now, 3 months ago, I would have had to offer a completely different interpretation of this, right? Because the coronavirus news wasn't there at that point. And certainly, there are other things that this can represent. It's not just the virus, but there's something very medical about Neptune and Chiron, the wounded healer, right? Neptune, which has a lot of connections with Pisces in the 12th house. And Jupiter here, which is expanding on all of that too. Now, here's what I found interesting just a moment ago. So look at that, big circle for Donald Trump, right? Well, where else does it go? Kind of interesting. It does go to Italy. Jupiter. There's Chiron and Neptune. So his experience here with, Italy, where, one of the key places where the virus is blown up and probably been transmitted from, it actually touches on that. It's kind of interesting. And then would go down this way as well. Now, here they are at the midheaven. Iran is another one of these places that's hit really hard by this. So there's Neptune midheaven, then we have Chiron midheaven, Jupiter midheaven. Wuhan, let's actually put that on the map for a moment. I don't even know where that is really in terms of the actual relative to other places in China. So, all right, well, let's just look at this for a moment. In Wuhan, not Trump's favorite place at the moment. What does he have there? Pluto descending. That is, which Pluto line is that? That is the In-Mundo Pluto lines. That's the one you would see on a Jim Lewis map. The other Pluto position is off to the left a little bit, but certainly the In-Mundo one is working well here. Very, very close. So there was a question recently, what would you connect with viruses? And Neptune and Pluto are pretty good, significations for that. And I think some kind of amplification with Jupiter or the nodes of the moon can take that up a notch. But the latitude for Wuhan is Venus Chiron. So another, the key of Chiron often, and here, this actually is a great example of it in DC for him too. I mean, where it says that his experience of being in DC is like Chiron in some way. And Chiron, the wound of Chiron is when something, well, to describe it, it typically feels unfair. So you're Donald Trump, your stock market's doing great, you survived impeachment, you got a good chance to be reelected, then this happens. Does that sound like a Chiron thing? Absolutely. That's like you felt like you were doing everything you should do. Something crazy and unexpected happens. It feels unfair. That's the key word. And it feels unfair, and yet it creates this need for a bigger adjustment to get the hero on his path or the heroine on her path. So Venus and Chiron, yeah, so there is a Chiron piece there. There's a Pluto piece there, certainly. If we look at this relocated chart, kind of interesting for Trump over there as well. And we'll move on, I think, from this in a moment. But I'll just say for now, look at Saturn within a degree of that sixth house cusp there in the Porphyry system. His Venus right there. This is the opposite of Trump. Look at this. This is kind of neat. This is the opposite of Trump in like DC. So let me just relocate Trump to DC real quick. And this is one of the reasons why he has such an interesting experience as president. Because when we look at his relocated chart there, we'll look here at this, 12th house cusp. 25 Cancer, basically, right there. And Saturn and Venus, their midpoint is right there. So in DC, he's 12th house, which means he's confined to that Oval Office. It's a kind of prison, and presidents, they end up in this situation. When George W. Bush was reelected, if I'm not mistaken, there was a Saturn piece. But anyway, the sense of, okay, now you got more work to do. Well, here in the 12th house, he's got a lot of work to do. So that's connected with hospitals, right? Connected with, in that sense, healthcare. So Saturn Venus is very 12th house for Trump in DC, and I hadn't actually looked at this until I just pulled it up, but look at Wuhan, China. It's very 6th house. It's the opposite placement. It's the other very medical placement. I mean, the 8th house is another one that's very medical too, but 6 and 12 have a lot of those, medical themes as an axis. So I find that pretty interesting over here for Trump. And this now, I mean, we'll see how much this ends up defining his presidency. I mean, it seems like it's an awfully big deal at the moment, but we hope it's not. But and not only that, we have, of course, good old astrocartography, right? Mars rising, very, very close to DC for Donald Trump. And notice too, if we look at him there in DC, there is a difference between being east or west of those lines. For that, we want to use the, not the Jim Lewis position, not the Inmundo position, but if I can speak, the zodiacal position, which moves it even closer to DC. DC is still just east of that. So DC is awfully Martian for Trump. Yay. So, I mean, obviously you could have predicted ahead of time that he's going to have a lot of those conflicts that Mars is going to portend. Sure, it could be war, but not necessarily. There are all sorts of other, conflicts that you get to fight here. And there's generally this, aggressive nature, right? And of course, that's how he goes about everything. He's very aggressive, and so that Mars is right there. But if we look at the chart again, Mars is still because it's east of that Mars line, it's at the end of the 12th house for him. So the 12th in DC has Saturn and Venus at the cusp. That's also true if we use equal house, where the cusp would be 27 Cancer, pretty much the same. Or similar anyway. Pluto's in the middle of the house. Mars is at the end of the house. And what you'll find in locational astrology that's quite fascinating is the cadent houses, and this goes to the Gauquelin research if you know anything about that. The cadent houses actually become the most commonly referred to. And there are reasons for that. This is a good example of it. For example, we have an angular Mars, but it's at the end of the 12th. So the key expression of that is going to be 12th house. No one really taught me that. I just saw enough charts and it was just the most obvious thing I'd ever seen. And people, I see people still trying to figure this out. I don't know. Like I guess that was kind of bad for me to say, but it's not that hard to figure out. And And it's not that the places, like you'll see people say, oh, the places west of the line are stronger for that planet because it's angular. It totally depends on the house. It depends on what you're wanting to do with it. For example, the third and fourth house are quite different in the sense that the fourth house is quite introverted. It's a domestic, private place. It's the home. It's the family. The third house is a house of siblings and friends and short distance travel. And so you move around, you talk to people, and you learn stuff. Well, depending on which planet you have being emphasized, you may or may not want that planet to be third house or fourth house. You might say, oh, I don't want to, I've already been isolated. I've already been at home all the time. So why, just checking the recording. Yay, we're still recording and audio is recording. That's good. We're halfway through. Why have that? So these are important things. And so the 12th house for Trump is very, very, very highlighted by this, and in a Martian way. And so that's what we're coming down to, the issue of ventilators. Saturn and Venus here are in Cancer, which is ruled by the Moon. The Moon and Mercury are two of the planets that you'll see, or quote unquote planets, that you'll see connected with lung issues. So are there going to be respirators so people can breathe? Like America doesn't have enough for what we're potentially looking at here. So we can kind of riff on some of that. So yeah, a whole new perspective here on Mars in the 12th for Trump, and extremely angular. Like, he is just itching to, cause some issues there. I mean, for Trump, this is also some other examples of this. His hidden enemies, right? He's always wondering who's leaking within his inner circle, who's leaking the information. What else? He has friends going to jail, right? A lot of his people who have been around him are in jail, or he's already exonerated them or whatever. So the 12th house is jail, and Mars can be, thieves, rogues, like people who are, basically not doing the right things. And there were some of his people who got, who ended up in jail because they weren't doing the right things. So a lot of them are kind of Marsy types, So yeah, so this is it's pretty interesting here. So we each have this map, right? And we each have these lines that go around the Earth, and we can follow them and find out where they go. And so one of the keys is, once you find out the planets you do want to emphasize, and that's where it's really tough. That's the thing that takes the longest to know how to do is, let's say for Trump, I don't know, should he live on a Mars line or not? Generally, I don't recommend Mars lines that often because it's a natural malefic. It naturally causes disruptions. If you want a long-term relationship, it brings about divorce most of the time. So I don't often recommend Mars, but of course there are cases where you look at a Mars and you think, wow, that's a nice looking Mars you got there. let's see if we can put that in a good place. And so that's where you really get the subtlety. And I look at the Western, and I look at all the Western techniques, and the Vedic techniques. And I was starting to say earlier that a lot of these meanings for the two systems, to me, they become more and more the same the more I use them. So the second house, for example, this isn't the best example of it, but the second house in Vedic astrology you'll hear is a house of the family, which is just kind of different. And it's a key meaning of the second house in Vedic astrology. So the second and the fourth, to me, become very important houses for the family, quote unquote. And you'll definitely see that, even if you put malefics and tough stuff and stuff, with lots of hard aspects and planets in their fall and stuff like that, you put them with the second house, you see bad stories with the individual's family in that place, like difficult stories. So you put difficult placements in the right place with the second. Now, that is part of what I'm going to teach in the class is how do you actually know if it's a big deal or not? And if you just see, even just these gnarly looking malefics in the second, it's not necessarily that big of a deal. There's actually kind of a little more of a science to it. And we're gonna go into exactly how to do that, of course, when I do the class. So a lot of the times these meanings, they become more and more the same. And that's why I think this is quite teachable, is I can tell you the meanings of the second house from a combination Western and Vedic interpretation. I think probably as much as anything, the meanings of the houses are the things that are very much the same. Because, particularly with what I do, with what I do, you're going to have a certain place. You're going to have a certain relocated place, right? This individual here in South Korea. And So I'm just looking at the chart again. You're going to have these influences to see, and you want to focus on the things that are most emphasized in a certain way, and there's just kind of a subtle art to that. But it's also very simple and mathematical, and so there are ways to kind of quantify this. And I'm even now going about the process of writing out interpretations of different things that could be used for software, where it could, randomly. That's the thing. People come to me and they say, "Hey, is there a way to just put it in and just have the computer spit out the best place?" And I have not yet done that, but I haven't designed the software yet either. And I'm starting to make some efforts in that direction, at least, like working with that and seeing how it could be. And it's neat to do that and see how exacting it can be and how you can kind of quantify it a certain way. So that's making me even hopefully even better at what I do, because I have to think about every little thing and write about every little thing, think about all the little possibilities. So so we're getting a sense here of holistic astrology, right? We're curious, we're humble, we're curious. Hey, does Vedic astrology work here in a certain way? Does Western astrology work here a certain way? Does Hellenistic, whatever? You have to be curious and humble and open and try to see with greater depth by taking in a little more information. And if we can simplify the information so it's not overwhelming, and then put these things together, then we try to, put everything together. So I'm going to go ahead and stop for a moment and check the chat and see what we got going on there. Kathy said he presents himself as a wartime president. That's new, isn't it? Yeah. I guess he's saying that now. Do you read parents as the actual environment and the events that tend to occur around a client versus how the client perceives his or her or their environment in your experience? Okay, yeah, awesome question. I would definitely say the experience, the environment, what's really happening there. For example, if I drive in my car, right, with like I said, I have a girlfriend right now. Say I go down there with my girlfriend. I think I'm going to have a different experience in Prescott, where I live, versus in Phoenix because of that parent. So these things, it's hard to separate them out sometimes. But I think the simple way to put it is, I know what that energy feels like. I know that I get into a Moon and Pluto space if I go down to that latitude. So my own emotional, mental state is different. Like I might be more reactive, I might, I don't know, have a more intense feeling about something. So there is a psychological component to that. I don't want to certainly cut that off. That would not be holistic astrology. That's really important. So yeah, so sorry, I distracted myself by looking at the comments. We have to see basically the effect that it tends to produce. So there's an element of, okay, how do we perceive this? How do you respond to it? Essentially, is important. Like, how do I respond to a Moon and Pluto line like that? What do I do with it? What do I maybe choose to do with it? Now, if I had a chance to go do some, I don't know, holotropic breath work down in Phoenix and to have some emotional release kind of healing work or something, that would be a good expression of Moon and Pluto. And in fact, I've done things like that, on Moon and Pluto line, the parent anyway. So yeah, I think to try to answer that more succinctly, I do think it's mostly what tends to occur in that place. It's the fundamental quality of this experience there. Like when I went to Tucson, I couldn't get well, right? I was sick. When I go to Phoenix, it's just, the energy is a bit different. I go back to Prescott, things feel pretty normal, for the most part. I've been here now since 2002. Over time, that's been quite true. Someone asked, what's the worst line to live on? And it does vary. It really varies per chart. The worst line for you to live on could be, Jupiter or Venus. Maybe you have Jupiter in Capricorn or Venus in Virgo or any number of things that could really make those planets more difficult for you. That might be your worst line, actually, there are certain parents that I think tend to really stink, where I can easily put them in that category of, I would never live on this line if it were me. Like I would never, based on everything I've seen, the odds where I think it's about 80 or 90% likely this is going to absolutely be terrible for you. There are some parents like that I will just avoid, just tell people to avoid, or at least tell them what I think it is, what I think it's going to be like, and then tell them, hey, if you go there, you can check it out and see if I'm right. See if it feels that way. You will find parents are interesting because they're so specific. So when you go right to where they are, especially if you go really close to where they are, they have dramatic impact, like really dramatic. So you can feel the difference even 5 or 10 miles off of those guys. So that can be very, very useful to avoid or to move toward or to understand exactly how that works. So, what's the best line usually for people to live? Yeah, and so I'm sorry, it does depend on the chart again. And there are certain pairings that I really like for people in general. That is something we will go over in the class. I did teach the class last year, and I used the pairings a lot, but I didn't really give kind of a comprehensive thing about, okay, here's literally like how to read these. And that's part of what I'm going to endeavor to do here. And anyone that I give that to, they'll just have to sign a waiver thing about it because I may use that information, in other places. So there will be some good examples there of things that tend to be quite good, things that tend to be quite bad. And if you get the parents right, it often makes a huge, huge, huge difference. Like you might be in a place that's kind of okay with your relocated chart and your local space lines and your astrocartography lines. And there are a couple other things we're not talking about yet today either. But for now, we'll stick to that. If you look at these things, you might see any number of influences, but the parents, if they're good, can make a place really good. Like really just tip the scales, There's this very Libran process here, and I do, honor my sidereal Vedic Libra rising here. There's a lot of weighing and balancing, and there's a lot of turning those knobs that I was telling you about. So you've got each planet has a knob, and it's turned up or down in certain ways. And that's a lot of what we do in locational astrology. We're looking at which things we're turning the volume down on, which things we're turning the volume up on. We're also changing the context of some things. We're putting them in different houses, of course. That's a big part of what we look at. And it's a really subtle Libran kind of balancing act kind of thing. Or at least that's one of the ways I like to look at it. So let's see. How much compromise do you make between charts and places when more than one person is involved in a move? Yeah, another really good question. I love it when I work with individuals. It's much harder to work with 2 or more people. I don't mind so much. It's what I do, but there's a sigh of relief when I see that my client for the day or one of my 2 clients for the day in some cases is an individual, because it's way easier. I don't have to, like, one individual you might find, I don't know, you might be able to find 5 or 10, I'm just going to throw something out. 5 or 10% of the places I look at, I might say, hey, I think this is actually really cool. Some people are more lucky. Some people, it's like you can just almost look anywhere for them sometimes, and it's like they've got something to work with. And some people are really hard. It's really hard for some people to find, the right spots for them. So everybody's different, and everybody gets kind of dealt their own, their own hand. So I love working with one person. Next thing is when you have an individual and then they send you their info and you think, hey, it's just one person. And then you find out once you start, oh, by the way, I have a husband or a kid or a parent who's moving with me or something like that. So people often think that, well, put themselves first, look at their own stuff. Okay, but if you're moving with another individual and their chart sucks in that place, it's not going to help you. And guess what? If where you show up in their chart is in a tough place, then that shows that you have a bad experience because of that individual being there. So theoretically, you could have a kind of neutral chart in a place and move there with someone who has an amazing chart in that place that shows, like, for example, say you're a woman and you're going to be represented by Venus most likely in the man's chart or woman's chart, I guess. So you go to that place, and let's say you're a woman with a man. You move to a place with a man. In the man's chart, Venus is not well situated. His relationships don't look good. Blah 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 blah. Well, guess what? You're his partner. That's not going to help you. So you have to look at the other people that you're moving with, basically. And sometimes people do this with their kids too. Like they'll kind of include their kids as an afterthought. But once again, free information. You've got kids. We can look and see their chart. Do we see the mom in their chart? Maybe the moon. Maybe Venus actually can be the mom too. What's Venus doing in the kids' chart, or what lines do they have? What parents or local space or any number of other things that we get into. So you have to look at everybody if you want to be holistic and you want to be smart about it. I mean, I wouldn't want to make a move. I have 3 kids without looking at all of them. Now it gets way harder to make a move when you got 3 kids, by the way, or 3 anything, because you just have more charts to look at and more stuff. There was a point actually where we've lived here since 2002, and we had a really nice life for the most part. for a long time and recently got divorced. And this is a true story. I tried to get us to move about a year or so before, about a year and a half before we started really getting divorced, because, it's a long story, but basically there were things that had shifted. And I told my wife at the time, I really felt like we had to move, that we were going to start to have a lot of problems. And I tried, actually. I really tried. And I did even find some spots that I thought could work for the five of us, which is, kind of saying a lot. It's hard to do that. But anyway, long story short, we didn't move. I wanted to, but, it takes two. So we didn't. And these things are very, very complicated when you get more and more people involved. Honestly, it's the kind of thing that would make me think twice about having kids. If you if you don't have them, or if you already have one, every time you add another chart to your life, there's a real risk of things becoming much more complicated. Let's say you have a good place, and I've seen this plenty of times. You have a place that works for two adults. They have a kid. The kid's chart changes the whole thing. Or they have a first kid, and it's fine. The second kid changes everything. So, man, yeah, be as much as you have any control over that, be careful, because it changes everything. So we have to look at everybody. So how do you compromise on that? Sometimes people will tell me, they'll say, his work is more important, or, my happiness is more important, or whatever. And you have a lot of sweet couples that'll, look after each other in that way. I work with, some older couples where one of them will say, it's really about my partner having this or that. So it's really, in that point, it's more of a conversation. It's more like, okay, well, how do we find the right balance for you guys? Like, what is going to be important for you guys going forward? Okay, your partner wants to retire and play golf. Okay, and you want to do this or that thing. So how do we find that? Let's see. Would you use where you connect together in your synastry? Let's see if I can answer that here. So synastry is interesting. I don't do a lot with synastry techniques with locational astrology. Other people might be a good thing to do. I have looked into it a bit. The only time you can use a map for two people, let's say, I don't know, let me take two people here. Do we have two people I can use here? I guess so. I'm just going to use my client and me. I don't know, just randomly here. Let's go for a composite chart. Let's say you did a composite chart, you had this individual, put me in there. Oops, nope, there we go, that's right. If you use the composite midpoint chart, you cannot use it in locational astrology, really. The only thing you could try to do there is use the midpoint positions from a geodetic reference, but that's a long story. So we have a Davison chart. The Davison chart is the midpoint in time and space between two people. So this individual was born in Denver. I was born in Elizabeth, New Jersey. We find the midpoint between those two things. It's going to be somewhere probably in Illinois. And, we're born in different years. So we're going to take the midpoint in time. So the midpoint in time for us is 83, July 83. So that is a moment in time based on a place in time. In fact, I think we can just put that up here, right? So there it is in Illinois between, New Jersey and Colorado. So there's the midpoint in space. And, I'm born in 75 and this individual is born in 91. So, the midpoint there is in the 80s. Let's see if I can fix this here. There we go. Okay, so you could use this. I don't. I've looked into it a little bit. I've researched it. It didn't work consistently enough for me to use it. You may have better luck with it. Be careful. I don't think it works that well, but maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. So that's an example where you could try to do something. I just wouldn't really recommend it for this particular purpose, but again, interesting. I meant profections above from Gene. Okay, wait a minute. Yeah, so I think I answered that one. Would you use where you connect together in your synastry? As much as it's more work, I just look at the individuals and I blend the information, and that's where it gets harder and harder and harder when you start looking at 3 and 4 people, and I'm keeping in my head, okay, wait, LA is like this for this one, and this for this one, but this for this one, but this one's like this. I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. I'd be wary of anyone who offers you a simple way to do that. I think for me, it's pretty complex. There's a lot of little parts to it. So, but that's the kind of thing we will certainly do in the classes, is look at how to do stuff like that. Okay, so perfections, lunar returns, etc. from relocated or natal. Let's see. Oh, no problem. Thank you for asking a good question. Okay, so I would not personally do, well, I personally wouldn't, I don't use perfections. I wouldn't use them from the Relocated. Um, you know, Relocated, what we have is now the other thing Jim Lewis did, besides the two things, he used parens and astrocartography, or astronomically angular positions, as his sort of natal stuff. Like, what is it, what do you see natally? And so he used that, but he also had cyclocartography, which is also a whole other approach. And I actually lean less towards cyclocartography than some people do. But I can show you maybe like an example of this. So I'll just put up my secondary progressions and transits. This is how they're moving across the country for me right now. And this is, I do find this really interesting. Like, here's like my Mercury ascendant. Now, what we're looking at here is my progressed Mercury, which is in Libra. And so I'm gonna click back a number of years, okay? So this one has been really fascinating for me because I've watched this one over the years. Mercury rising in San Francisco, go back to 2008. Well, I remember going back and speaking in more than once in San Francisco, hanging out with a bunch of astrology friends there, giving these lectures. I spoke on the nodes. I spoke on some other Vedic type stuff. Did another lecture. I remember, like being drawn to this area with lots of like friends and astrology. And then I remember when it went to LA and San Diego, same kind of stuff. I was doing the same kind of stuff. I was down there giving more lectures and everything. Then it went to Las Vegas. I went there literally for this writing seminar that kind of changed my life, and I wrote a couple novels after that. And where I went to meet all these writers, I met a bunch of best-selling writers. One of them became my editor for my second book. I met them when that happened, and then of course the fascinating part, it came to where I live more permanently. And this was a little surprising because let's look at the timing on that. Let me just make sure I have the facts right on this. So it's about 3 years ago. I went through, let's see, I'll show you, in 2015. So let's say like July 2015. This was when I went to massage school, and I was there for 6 months. So if we go forward about 6 months, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's really close because I live right in the middle of Arizona here. So Mercury rising is right there. And this was in between a period where I actually on the side, because I'd really always wanted to try being a teacher. I really like working with kids. So I tried teaching kids. I taught a little 4th grade, and then I taught 7th and 8th grade math for a little bit. And this was all around that same time. In fact, I taught the 4th grade before massage school and then the other one after massage school. So Mercury ascendant, and I literally become a math teacher, a massage therapist. Mercury rules the hands. I learned, obviously going through massage school, learn a lot about the body and all that. So that was Mercury ascendant. Definitely, did something, Now, if we go years, I can keep following this guy and keep saying, well, what happens when, I don't know, Mercury goes to Tucson, right? Maybe it's already there. Let's see. Where are we here? We're at, let's go to the present day. And, it's just fun to watch these things move over time, too. So right now, I've got that Mercury right there in Durango, Colorado. One of my, buddies online that I'm chatting with all the time. We're both, kind of sharing links about the coronavirus and stuff. He lives right there in Colorado, so I'm not too surprised about that. Then I could try to plan something for, Albuquerque, Santa Fe, Denver, Boulder, because this line seems to work well for me. Mercury generally is a pretty good planet for me, so I like a lot of the results I get from that. So this is an example of something Jim Lewis did. He used progressions of the quicker planets like Mercury here and the transits of the slower planets. And you can see things changing over time in places. And this is a whole other approach. It's really fascinating because basically with what I do, my emphasis is on the stuff that's permanent. I do not necessarily look at this for everyone. I would rather get the place right first because I know that things always change. Now, in the final analysis, yes, like, okay, let's take a look and see if this place that looks really great for you also has some terrible transit for the next year, and you maybe just want to wait a year to move or something. So it's definitely part of the a holistic analysis and discussion about it all. But I tend not to lean on this as much because I feel like my gift is more with the permanent things in a place and helping you see what's always there. And if you get that right, then you're good. So the analogy I use for that is I'd like to give you a strong ship, a really strong hull, and that means get you, hopefully, find places for you where you can have a strong ship, where you are permanently in a more or less good place. Of course, things change over time. And sometimes we just need to be somewhere else for a while. But that's my goal, is to get you to a place where you can weather the storms. So if a storm comes and it's a tough year, you're in a solid place. An opposite approach to that would be where you move more frequently. And most of my clients don't want to do that. And if you do that, then I would say you've given someone perhaps a weak ship. It's not like an all-around good place, perhaps, but maybe they have a good transit or progression. And so they can benefit from it for a little while. So maybe you find them nice weather. Well, here's nice weather in Casper, Wyoming for the next year or something. So I'm more of the big, strong ship kind of guy. Other people like the small, nimble ship that moves around all the time. But most of my clients don't want to move around all the time, so it's just not that practical. So if we go back to things like, what other techniques could we use? Well, we could use other techniques, right? So, maybe those returns and other things like that could be brought into how you look at psychocartography, or, really that just means how, the influence of a location is changing over time, or the changing weather of a certain location. Couldn't you use a first meeting event chart? I do like first meeting event charts for telling you things about the relationship. I have not used it with locational astrology to predict, things from that. So I cannot say really. Okay. Yeah. So someone was saying that David Cochran, who he does the Kepler software and lots of cool stuff, conferences, etc. He thinks his birth time is off a few minutes due to knowing he had great success at a certain place he lived when one of his lines crossed right through that town, but it was about 2 to 3 minutes different to his birth time. I would be curious what he is looking at that would change in 2 to 3 minutes. There are some things that can change. Like I look at some things that could change that much, but even then, not usually. Like you wouldn't normally get that big of a difference in 2 to 3 minutes. You can, but it's kind of, the longer of a time frame we're looking at, the more likely it's going to get weird. So if it's 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20, the longer, obviously it's off from the birth time, the more likely there could be big changes. So yeah. In fact, okay. So the reason I had this client in here today, in my notes, was because this person came to me recently and said, hey, I need another reading. I found my actual birth time. So initially, the times were about 65 minutes apart. And, the individual thought she had the time, right, in the first place. So we did a reading. And she said afterward, it was like, well, it was kind of yes, kind of no. And then she came back recently and said, oh, well, we actually found the birth certificate, and I'm born at 2:10 a.m. So we looked at that again. And it worked better. I showed you the example of Sol for this individual. There was Saturn and Mars coming through his local space. There was Pluto as rising astrocartography. There was a Mars series among other parents that were there. And there were other things going on in the Relocated Chart and yada, yada. So yeah, you have to consider all those things. And in this case, it was good to have that sense of, oh, okay, now that we have the right time, it feels like things are aligning more. Now, one of the reasons you can be partially right, even if someone has a birth time off by an hour, for example, the parents don't change all that much. Most of the things will. If you change the birth time an hour, you're going to get a lot of changes. Like your big astrocartography lines, they're going to move, quite a bit. I mean, in 1 hour, they're going to move 1/24th of the way across the Earth, more or less. So you're going to get changes with that. Yeah. So good. I think we're caught up on the questions here in the chat, and we are getting closer to our time here, but we still have a little time. Let's see. So we still have about 15 minutes here. What else do we want to talk about here? Let's see if I've got anything else in my notes here. I do want to just speak a little bit again about the seriousness of this. I was saying earlier, a lot of things you can do in astrology aren't really going to change someone's life all that much. But this will. This really will. And I think we have to be really careful. If you ever, and I feel, I do this work and I know how karma works, and I try to be super careful because I know that, everything I say is so important. I know that someone can move to a place and have a much harder time. They might have a harder time with their finances or their relationships or relationships with their daughter or anything, any number of things. So obviously we're working with real people and real lives and real, hearts and feelings and desires and wishes. So, my honest opinion, I sit in my chair here and I do this pretty much every day and, sometimes multiple times a day. And that's what I do, like year in, year out. This is kind of the staple of my life. It's probably the most consistent thing in my life. So based on my experience, I'm just going to give you my honest opinion. I think people who are doing astrocartography as it's typically practiced are just missing too much of the puzzle. Sometimes if you're missing part of the puzzle, you can get it right. Sometimes you won't. Sometimes you will get it wrong because you're missing parts of the puzzle. Other times you might be like, oh, okay, I can still see what it is and basically get it right. I'm not saying astrocartography is not useful. I'm saying it's not necessarily sufficient. It's not necessarily enough. And I know that because I look at a bunch of other things that are also important. And so if you tie my arms behind my back and close one of my eyes and then, put some dark shades over my eyes and you limit my tools, well, I'm going to have a harder time seeing the truth, the reality of things. So I believe as people practice astrocartography today, and I'm sorry it's probably not popular with everyone to say it, I just don't think, and I do say this based on my experience, I don't think you actually have enough tools to get it right, to consistently get it right. So that's critical because we have a lot of people doing astrology in that way, making recommendations which may or may not be good. And I'm not saying I'm perfect, but I am doing my best, and I am looking at more influences with a bigger view of the whole tradition of astrology. I'm looking at, how did reception work in medieval astrology? How do the nakshatras come into play in Vedic astrology or the Vedic dashas and different things? Right? I'm looking at all these things that I can look at, and always trying to look at more, always trying to learn more, always trying to do better, because I know if people make changes to their lives based on my advice, that's sacred stuff. And I don't want them to go to a place where they're going to be worse off than where they are. That's not why I'm in this body. I'm here to help people. I'm here to help people have a better life, have more abundance, more of what they're looking for, or at the least understand it better. Like that's what it can be so useful for. Okay, hey, I live in Minneapolis, and okay, well, what is Minneapolis for you? And yes, some things change over time, but for the most part, I can tell you a bunch of stuff. Hopefully, that is always there. And then how do you work with that? So there's a really grave element to this, and I mentioned in another video one time a story of a client who came to me. She had been to another astrologer. It was a famous astrologer who wasn't necessarily expert in locational astrology, astrocartography. This astrologer recommended going to a place where her partner ended up committing suicide after some awful stuff. Now, there's no doubt what was on that map would have told me very clearly to tell her not to go there. And I would have definitely told her that. I would have said, I would not do this because this Mars-Pluto pairing that you have here is intense or whatever it was. It was some combination of Mars, Saturn, and Pluto. It was one of those. It was two of those three, I remember. I don't think it was Mars, Saturn, though. And I could look that up. But anyway, that happened, right? So she went to this place. The astrologer told her, yeah, it's going to be okay. There's going to be some problems with the police. Or he said something kind of flippant, like some little insignificant thing. Now, from what I knew, that line was like potentially like, why on earth would you choose to live on that line, especially when you're concerned? Like she went to an astrologer out of concern, saying, is this a safe place for me and my partner to live? And the astrologer, famous astrologer, did not know what he was doing, frankly, guys. And he told her to go to this place, and it was awful. And, I don't have a parallel universe to compare what would have happened if she'd gone to somewhere else. But what the result was pretty damn consistent with things that I know are not what you're looking for in that case. So that is to say, be very careful and assume that you don't know enough. And I have to assume I don't know enough, even though I'm trying every day and I've been doing this for 20 years or so. I've been really serious about locational astrology for about 20 years. And again, just always refining. So my whole approach to astrology is called holistic astrology, and holistic locational astrology to me is kind of the the pinnacle of that, because you have to understand, really in the end, you do have to understand a lot of the subtleties of your system of astrology, maybe multiple systems of astrology. Because if you don't really know how to interpret, hey, is this Jupiter line really good for someone? I mean, I was in a situation recently, I wonder if I could pull that one up, where, there was a Jupiter line, and there was a big question, and this individual had been told by a couple other astrologers, locational astrologers, to go to the Jupiter line. I might even be able to pull this one up and show you. And I was really iffy about it. Like, I didn't necessarily feel that was the right move for that person. And it was a Jupiter line. So let me just see here. Yeah, I might be able to pull this up, but anyway, the story is typical advice: go to a Jupiter line, and this was a Jupiter that was really likely to give her some of what she wants, and other things were definitely not what she would want, I would think. So Jupiter in general, right, is a benefic, right? He's the greatest benefic. He's going to give us generally the nicest free stuff. He's going to be our Santa Claus, and so any Jupiter line will do some of that. The question is, is that really a good Jupiter? Is that really going to give you more and more of what you want in life, or is that Jupiter showing that you're going to have to actually work harder for what you want? And that can be the case. You can have a Jupiter where, yeah, you get some benefits and you got to work really hard for them, or you have this challenge or that challenge going on with it too. So, yeah, that whole thing, I mean, please, let's kill that dead. Let's just stab that thing repeatedly. And by that, I mean the thing where we say, oh, go to a Jupiter line. What's the best line, right? You see that in these astrocartography forums. And people think that there's an answer to that. They think that you can tell them, oh, Venus is the best line. There's no way in hell you can tell them that. You got to see their chart, So yeah, we got to stop recommending lines because it's Venus or Jupiter or whatever. And sometimes you do want to recommend those lines, right? But you want to do it with a careful consideration of that planet. Dispositors, aspects, reception, all the essential dignities, Vedic side, you have various considerations, is it in a Pushkar Navamsha? Is it the Avayogi planet? There's so many things. There's just a lot of things. Is the planet in its own nakshatra? That's like a hidden dignity. So that's where the careful weighing and balancing comes in, and that does take a long time to really learn how to do that. But then again, hopefully I can give you a huge head start on that and give you the key principles that you need to kind of start to do that. And I'm excited with this then to show people how to just kind of, try different things, like say, okay, try a sidereal interpretation here as if it was, just for a moment, maybe pretend it was tropical. What would you say about this Mars in Cancer, if it was in the tropical zodiac? And starting to learn how you can do that and not have to necessarily learn a vastly different system. Yes, you ideally would. Ideally, you would learn it, go as deep as you can with any given system that you study. But even if you've got the basics, if you're like a B or C level, Vedic astrologer on some level, or student of Vedic astrology, you will at least notice the big stuff. And the big stuff is often the main stuff. So that is really important to kind of look at that here. How does daylight savings affect charts and readings? We just have to make sure to get the right time zone. So we definitely look at that. We look at, was daylight savings in effect, and that sort of thing. And then that's pretty much it. That was not too hard. Can good lines temper cultural and personality misfits? Interesting question. Well, sure. I mean, because the locational astrology is showing you your experience, showing you the key archetypal energies present in your experience in any given place. So, if you have someone like that, and maybe you have a place that is softer, more friendly, or hey, maybe they want to be more isolated. Maybe you find a place where the isolation works for them. That's a big part of what I try to do. A big part of what I try to do here is be really aware of what each individual is really looking for, because I might see something on a chart where I would say to 9 out of 10 people, gosh, I would never want to live there because of this and that. And for that 10th person, you say, okay, actually, this is a perfect fit for you. I'm thinking of a client who was really, really into the spiritual path, like to the nth degree. And the chart was, that kind of chart too. This person would actually kind of benefit, because their history showed that they benefited from going to some of the most intense things. Now, be careful with that. Be careful with that. I'm not recommending this. But this individual, they could go to places where, let's say, the 8th and 12th houses were activated in very interesting ways. And they were all on board for that sort of moksha or bust, spiritual all the way approach. So you got to be sensitive to each individual. This is why when I work with people, I don't like to work on my own. People say, "Hey, can you just do a recording for me? Can you write up a report?" No, I actually don't like to do that, because I want you to be there and I want you to help me when I have a question. So I make sure that I'm giving you what you want, and we work together. It becomes a collaborative process. And then I can show you, okay, well, now that we can see how your Jupiter lines work or your Mars lines or whatever, now we see exactly where they are. Now you can choose if you want to go to them or not. Or maybe you want to go to it, but not too close to it. There's so many little details like that. And I love the details, I do have Venus in Virgo. And I think one of the ways that I teach things about the fallen planets, like Venus is in her fallen Virgo, is that the sign is always a strength. And I do think that I have a lot of positive Virgo qualities. Like I'm kind of real health oriented. I'm real service oriented. And part of that Virgo is I like the details. I like understanding the math. I like understanding, how do we fine tune this stuff. So that's part of what you benefit from if you take my class. This Venus in Virgo, I have Jupiter and Chiron conjunct in Aries in the 6th house and opposite Uranus. And so that is me. Like I'm in the trenches. I work with clients. I have my own approach, my own system. And it's very tailored in a very Chiron way. It's a good thing about Chiron when you tailor things to the individual. That's what Chiron did in mythology. When the hero comes to Chiron, he helps them with exactly what they need. So that's certainly what I endeavor to do. I think that does show up in my chart with that kind of Jupiter Chiron and Aries, where I'm hopefully, leading a little bit, trying to push the envelope a little bit and show people some different things that we can do to raise this to the next level and be smarter about it. So that's kind of my thing, is when you study with me, I'm going to be, going to be doing a lot, sharing a lot of my experience. Haven't actually sat there and worked with a lot of people. And I like working with clients. I really do. A lot of astrologers don't like it. They'd rather teach, but I like working with clients. And the thing is, unless you do that, you can't learn, you don't get enough experience to really know what you're doing anyway. So let's see. Are you sending out this recording? How do we give our email address? I'll put it. I should be able to upload this, to my Facebook and YouTube, hopefully. And I'll have that link on the latest link on my website. On my website, you can always go here and check out... let's see if I close a little. You can sign up to my newsletter. That's a very good way to follow up with all my stuff. Also follow my Facebook. There's a link here that says latest, and that one will give you generally the most recent stuff I've been up to and links to things like newsletters and videos and such. And there's a lot of stuff I want to do. Still trying to get to start my podcast. I tried to do it last year, but divorce is fun, so didn't do that. But anyway, let's see if there's anything else. The class here, if you click on my classes link, there is an early registration discount. Right now it's $390 instead of $500. And then there's also an April 15th early registration discount if you're not ready by the end of March. And then the class is right there. So good. So we're just about out of time. So we're going to do a drawing for someone to get free tuition of the class. So now's the point at which you put your name in the chat if you want to be in the drawing for the class. Someone's clarifying, a move only 10 to 15 miles away can make a difference in your personal success or trouble. It can. It really can. How about a different apartment in the same complex? That I would not be able to help you with, but yay, we have a name. Okay. Okay, so we got some names coming in here. So we're going to stop the recording in a minute, and I'm going to do like kind of a random drawing and see who comes out of this. So yeah, the 10 to 15 mile thing, normally where that's going to make a difference is if you actually cross over a zodiacal astrocartography line, or if you, mostly it's going to be parens, moving north and south in terms of parens. Like you might move 15 minutes into one or away from one, and that can make a huge difference, especially if there's two in the same area. Maybe one of them is more beneficial for you and one of them is not so much what you're looking for. It's also possible if you are born near, if you're living near where you are born, mostly if you're living near where you're born, local space could be radically different. You could move 10 miles away, and it might be from your Saturn to your Jupiter, in local space. So that can be a really big deal too. Okay, so we're getting some names here. I'm going to stop this recording. We got almost an hour and a half, so that's just about perfect. So last thing here, thank you everyone for being with me today. My website is astrologyforthesoul.com. On Facebook, it's Astrology, the Cosmic Mirror with Moses Sirigar. I've got a Twitter, Instagram I occasionally do stuff with. So yeah, feel free to